So we are nursing faculty from MCPHS University, and we wanted to share our story about COVID lessons learned across the nursing curriculum. So the learning outcomes for this session after you complete this activity will be to identify strategies that the nurse educators use to transition clinical education to the virtual classroom, describe 2 current challenges with clinical-based education, and summarize creative approaches to utilization of technology to support nursing education, and also demonstrate knowledge of the steps taken by the School of Nursing faculty to prepare graduates for licensure, employment, and professional practice. So I'm going to take you back to March 13th, 2020. So in a time of COVID, so universities transition from traditional to in-person learning to remote classes, and faculty needed to be nimble and agile as we were faced with the challenge to rapidly change our methods of teaching. The pandemic conditions prevented nurses and nursing students from participating in their traditional lab and clinical experiences. Nursing faculty were challenged to ensure that our students have the necessary critical thinking, clinical skills, and competencies to graduate. So as faculty, clinical faculty had to develop case studies and place these case studies in the virtual setting. So we had our clinical groups, and we had our adjunct clinical faculty build in these scenarios with these students to really foster clinical judgment. This was a completely new approach for our faculty, our adjunct faculty, as they've never been in the virtual setting. And they were forced to, our students and our faculty were forced to act as almost as a telehealth provider. So our clinical faculty required a great deal of training. And we had to provide this training for our lab faculty as well, as they had to learn the technology platforms. We used Shadow Health as a virtual simulation. We pre-briefed and debriefed these scenarios. We were really looking to foster that clinical, those necessary critical thinking skills, the judgment. We also used our GoReact platform for clinical skills to really hone in on those clinical skills that the students were removed from lab. So we actually had our lab teams mailed totes to the students with all their clinical supplies that they would need, and they would have to develop these modules and show themselves doing these clinical skills with the lab faculty. We also used ATI, real life scenarios, where we could actually play a clinical case scenario and really dissect the clinical judgment to really force the students to think like a nurse. So this took a big, we had to really adapt the curriculum and provide a ton of training for our clinical faculty and lab. I think all faculty were really working hard to really develop what would be the best way to meet those end of course outcomes for our students and progress them through the curriculum. And I think, it really brought nursing academia across the country together, where we could really showcase our strengths and, form together. We had I received a lot of assistance on nursing blogs nationwide. So this was this was a nice silver lining where we could really collaborate across the country.
The common theme I was hearing from students were, are we going to graduate? I was overseeing a cohort of students who was to graduate in May of 2020. And when things happened in March, it really kind of put a spin on what is going to happen to us. What is the unknown? Many of our students had left campus during spring break, not to return. I had students that went home to visit family. They didn't bring their laptop with them. They didn't bring their textbooks with them. How can I expect them to progress in the curriculum if they don't have the tools handy in their new environments to be able to do this? And we facilitated mailing supplies, mailing technology. We found loaner computers. We found headsets. We found copies of ebooks that we hadn't had previously. We really made sure that they had what they need. in the environment that they were now learning in. We found that Zoom and also video platforms such as Blackboard, Collaborate were essential. This was our main communication tools with students, and it really offered that visual reassurance. And through that, we were able to help boost morale. We were able to foster resilience. We were able to instill hope in our students. Being approachable, developing an interpersonal connection versus just a professional connection with our students was essential. We really needed to empathize and let them know that we're all in this together. One of our very first meetings when we got together remotely, my student, they couldn't believe I did this. And I pulled up High School Musical and I played the little YouTube video of the song, "We're all in this together," to show them, you know, I'm human just like you are. We're going to navigate this together. We're all here to support each other. And most of all, I'm here to support and mentor you through this very difficult time. We found active learning strategies via Zoom were really essential in meeting our course objectives and outcomes. We formulated student teams to help them learn remotely. Again, it sounds silly, but it was really beneficial. My students and their teams, they had to change their avatar to a theme each week. Their little avatars on Zoom or on Blackboard. And, you know, 5 minutes of fun at the beginning of a session really made the difference in their engagement throughout the end and really helped them achieve those learning outcomes. It was quite competitive when I chose donut names for the theme of the week because everyone wanted to be a blueberry cruller. That was, you know, or I want to be on team strawberry sprinkles. And like I said, that may not be specific to nursing, but I think it was very, very specific and conducive to the atmosphere. And really help those students again engage in their learning activities. Virtual office hours really became 24/7 student support. I think every person on our team answered emails on nights, on weekends. We would meet one-on-one with students. If a student needed something, there was always someone there to step up and support them. I think we're still doing that to a certain degree now. That really hasn't gone away. Having transparent communication and a timely dissemination of information was essential. Transparent, even when we didn't know something, it was okay to say, I don't have that answer for you, but you know what? I'm going to help you find it. We're going to work through this together. Dissemination of information, especially when it was coming from our regulatory bodies and other areas beyond our control, changed daily. I had students that were trying to apply for NCLEX licensure, and what was posted as this is what we're supposed to do on a Monday, state boards of nursing would have new documentation or have a new process posted on Wednesday. It didn't even sometimes make it a full week without having changes. So really disseminating whatever information we had. And the university level was great. They really shared everything with students and with faculty as it unfolded. And then in turn, this was really the nursing specific information that we really tried to keep on top of to help students. In fact, I kept a spreadsheet of what student was going to be licensed in each state so we could follow those states for changes. Where the majority of our students are in Massachusetts and in New Hampshire, we really do have students that are across the country. Again, I was helping to navigate rules in California and Washington and Ohio and you know, so it was really helpful to have that organized, to really know where that targeted information needed to be. And then really, again, in fostering that resilience and that empathy with students was using the Kubler-Ross stages of grief. We were all experiencing a wide array of emotions and impact from COVID. We had students who were impacted directly, either through themselves or with their family members. A lot of unknown. And really, how do we work towards acceptance? And we still have people who are still in process of working towards acceptance, and there are people who are already there. But it really is, it's stages and it's a process, and it wasn't a marathon. I mean, it was a marathon, it wasn't a sprint, and it's still unfolding. Next slide, please. New graduates and challenges for securing their nursing licensure. We found this was very difficult. State of emergency orders were different in Massachusetts and in New Hampshire. They were also different in other states where our students were now learning from. Processes for licensure applications, background checks, fingerprints, notarized signatures. A lot of emergency orders came out to help nurses get licenses quickly in the states, but that was by reciprocity. It wasn't new time applicants. So that was a significant barrier that we identified early on, and we're actually able to bring to the Board of Nursing in New Hampshire and advocate to kind of streamline some of those processes. A good example here, state executive orders waived background checks for the FBI background check, which that was a big barrier at the time, but it didn't waive the one for students that required an in-state background check. And that in-state background check required a notarized signature. How do you get a notarized signature during a state of emergency when all essential services are closed? Our students traditionally would have their forms notarized right at the school. Our chief security officer was a notary. They used to always go in and see Bill. Another venue that they would use, there's a sub shop across the street from the Manchester campus. A lot of people go there for lunch, and the gentleman at the sub shop was a notary republic. His business was closed. So they were unable to obtain a signature that way. Even going to their bank only drive-throughs were open. It was really, how do we navigate? How do we figure this out? So it was a challenge. Regulatory standards, our boards of nursing, both Massachusetts and New Hampshire, again, evolving information. Sometimes it was daily, sometimes it was weekly. Very difficult to navigate to locate what is the most current information today, because that's all we could work with. And that's what we would tell students. You can only work with what you have available today, but be prepared for the unexpected. And how can we do that? How can we foster that? Some states offered temporary student licensures. This was tricky. I can speak to New Hampshire. The schools of nursing and nurse educators and even the practice partners, we all heard about this on our WMUR news before we heard about it from any information that was shared from the state level. Again, an executive order was created to say, hey, there's a need and I'm going to help fix this, which that's fantastic. But it talks to the need about bringing in the practice partners so that in turn we can speak to the students about it and faculty and have that insight as well. How do we navigate this? Paper forms. Students were still required to apply for licensure on paper. Students didn't all have a printer at home. So this was very complicated. Again, some required a signature. It had to be the original copy from a dean or a registrar from an approved school of nursing. How do you facilitate an original signature in a time of COVID? So by bringing light to, by identifying these problems and advocating for them, some of these processes have changed. So our December 2020 graduates did not face as many barriers as our May 2020 graduates had faced due to this. Another complexity was due specifically to the NCLEX exam. NCLEX exam is taken at Pearson VUE testing centers across the country. Pearson VUE decreased the operations of their testing centers. Some centers were closed altogether if there was multiple in a certain region or geographical area. Others had decreased hours of operations. And they did this to ensure a safer testing environment. They wanted to be able to really clean, put up barriers, control the amount of students in a room. So really good reasons why this was happening. But when you have, 100 students trying to sit for an NCLEX and you only have 20 spots, that's going to cause a delay. So being aware of that, the NCLEX responded by decreasing the exam time, which was very helpful to help process students through, and they decreased the numbers of questions. Again, still adhering to really making sure that students were going to enter the workforce safely and that they had the content knowledge that they needed, but really being able to cut down on some of the extra criteria that they felt that they could safely back off on, which again opened up more testing opportunities for students. Faculty leadership, I think the goal of all of us, all nurse educators, was transitioning the new nurses into the workforce now and doing it safely. We offered targeted and individualized mentoring sessions. Like I said, I had a spreadsheet. I knew across the country what student was going where, and if I had 20 students in Massachusetts, I could meet with them all at once. If I had 2 from California, I could put them together. If I had 1 from Ohio, I could definitely make sure to make a meeting with him. But we really, I don't want to say we held their hands, because they still had a lot of homework to do on their own. They still had a lot of the processes to navigate themselves, but they never felt alone. They needed to know that someone had their back, because it was not easy to find an answer. Next slide, please. So this is some feedback that we've received about their real world. After graduation, most of our students joined the frontline workforce. And as frontliners, quotes that were given to me that they said that they felt like they were jumping into a fire. They felt compared to being an infantry soldier on the front line. Some of them felt disposable. Some of them, there was a lot of fear of the unknown. They had experienced some delayed starts for their entry into practice and into the workforce. Many of them had actually secured employment prior to spring break with all of this happening. So it was wonderful to know that they had already gone through an interview process. They had already facilitated, they knew their residency was going to start on this date. But some of those residencies were pushed back. So there was some of the delays in there. Some of them faced challenges during employment orientation. So instead of being set with one nurse and having a mentor one-on-one experience, they may have been with multiple nurses, because nurses were being floated to other units, were covering critical needs. Units were being redesignated to care for the high influx of COVID-related patients. So the hospital settings themselves, when the makeup of that changes, the makeup of orientation changes along with it. Postgraduate mentorship has still been essential for this group of students. We keep in touch with our students. It's amazing how many emails we receive. It's really makes your day as a faculty member when a previous graduate says, hey, can you give me your opinion on this, or what do you think? And they're still coming back. And just having that, knowing that they have a continuation of faculty support, again, I think it's essential, because we're another cheerleader in their corner as they're navigating a very, very difficult time. And just to help with that boost and keep them all going. Next slide, please. So some of our results from 2020, I'm excited to share. Our 2020 BSN program data includes students from 2 different programs, but they're aggregated together. So we have a 16-month post-baccalaureate program that is taught across all 3 campuses. And we have a 32-month traditional BSN program that is specific to our Boston campus. In total for 2020, we had a total of 432 students, and we graduated 362 of them for a completion rate of 83.3%, which is very exciting because it still exceeds that national benchmark of 70. So very proud of our successes to retain our students during the crazy world of 2020. It was very nice to see that data. It was very inspiring. Our NCLEX pass rates. For 2020, our total is pending only because New Hampshire has not yet released the individualized scores for the state level. So we don't know how Manchester performed, but we do know that our Boston and our Worcester campuses, 85 and 97% performed outstandingly. And again, they exceeded that CCNE, that's our accrediting body. They exceeded that benchmark of 80%, which is really exciting to be able to see. And that is in line with our 2019 data as well. In 2019, our combined campus total for NCLEX pass rates was 93.6%. So it'll be exciting when we get the news from New Hampshire and we can really get that total for 2020. But it was wonderful to see this, to know these strategies we implemented, this virtual clinical, the lab boxes, performing lab from your kitchen table, doing all of these things, all of these teaching strategies. This worked, and this is our evidence that it worked. Next slide, please. Stephanie, you're muted.
Sorry. 1 year later, we continue to have current challenges, and our challenges remain with the reduction in clinical placement availability. Our clinical partners still are having challenges with organizational, like COVID units, reduction in our numbers. So it's still resulting in higher utilization of virtual simulation and clinical lab for our students. We are also having challenges with our lab space. We have to reduce our numbers of students that can go to lab so that we can do contact tracing and maintain safety for our students. So we have identified varied clinical experiences, and it may create gaps in our clinical education. So faculty have been extremely proactive in as we continue to really rely on virtual simulation and virtual lab as an asset now from lessons learned. So we are using these opportunities learned to really create clinical scenarios that they may not be receiving in the clinical setting. So maybe you've never seen a cardiac patient till now. We can create this virtual simulation for you where you will be critically thinking for a cardiac patient, or maybe you haven't seen a post-surgical patient. So we have now created this scenario where you really have to work through the case in either the lab or the virtual simulation setting. And it's facilitated by our clinical and lab faculty. And we're really provoking them to do a deep dive into the electronic medical record, really analyze those labs and really look at, the steps to clinical judgment, how to think like a nurse. We really want to close the gaps in the education. So this is how we are closing the gaps and ensuring that we are meeting our end of course outcomes. And we want to also reinforce those nursing skills. So as new graduates are entering practice with less facility-based hands-on clinical experience than previous graduates, we know that our partners are aware of that as well. So again, bridging those gaps, really fostering those, those forced, virtual simulation activities that we've identified as our gaps. And organizations need to anticipate the long-term challenges associated with a traumatic transition to practice. So there's a need for strong faculty-student engagement to build new nurses' confidence, which is essential to transition in new nurses from the academic center to the clinical practice, so that they don't, so that they can have a positive experience. So transition to practice considerations. So healthcare organizations, professional development specialists, healthcare educators, preceptors will all need to be mindful of the disruption of the students' clinical education, especially from 2020 and currently right now, as we continue to navigate and safely get our students to practice. I remain current in practice as a nurse leader at a large academic center in Boston. So I'm involved in the academic and the practice side, where I see students transition to clinical practice within the organization. So we need to reevaluate and re-envision our current transition to practice. We need to reinforce those skills, identify the gaps on the organizational level as well, to be mindful as these new graduates enter practice with different learning, social, and emotional needs. We need strong engagement and support for transition and new nurses from their academic center to their clinical practice. And we need we really need to form strong academic practice partnership strategies to support onboarding of our new nurses. We also need to collaborate between government officials, boards of nursing educators, and practice partners to support licensure, workforce development, and funding. And as a nurse leader working within these large organizations, we need to build a team that's going to support transition to practice. We've entered uncharted territory this past year. And we've also entered, the practice setting where we've seen higher rates of nurse burnout as these frontline nurses have been fighting and committed to practice through this pandemic. So these nurses, we need to create this safe space for these nurses to share concerns and provide support for them before they succumb to burnout.
I'd like to share with you some success stories from our May 2020 cohort. This is Eric. He's working at the Elliott Hospital on the CICU Cardiovascular Intermediate Care Unit. And John, he's working at Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center in the Medical Specialties Department. And that department actually has a world-renowned cystic fibrosis program embedded right into it. And also, interestingly, the other half of the unit turned into a COVID ICU during a time of need. Next slide, please. I have some more success stories. So Megan is working at Mount Auburn Hospital in Cambridge in the Gero Psych department. And Emily's in the western part of the state. She's at Bay State Wing Hospital working in the emergency room. And again, all of these students have been providing direct COVID-related patient care straight out of graduation. I am so proud of everything that they have accomplished, and they're thriving. They really are thriving. Next slide, please. So I'd like to bring you now to the current day, March 11th of 2021. And here's our success story of our students returning to clinical. Again, it's been varied across different campuses, across different cohorts, and the availability of our practice partners. But this particular group, this is when they returned in the fall of 2020 to the Elliott Hospital. And this was their first clinical day back since the pandemic had started in March. It was very exciting and very engaging for them. So this is Jody and Cassandra and Megan, Nicole, and Joanita. And with this, in closing, we would like to, extend. Does anybody have any questions? I see Cherie's hand is raised.
Hi, thank you so much for that presentation. That's fantastic. I'm going to turn my camera on for a moment so you can see me. But I really loved the whole thing, and I actually teach chemistry at Simmons for primarily nursing students, so it was really helpful to hear these other perspectives. I had a question for you related to laboratory medicine and how that part of the curriculum, if you introduce students to laboratory medicine, how that is done or how that has been done virtually. We have a lab that we do at Simmons where we have students, we introduce students to laboratory medicine and the different assays that are done and everything. But I was curious if, whether that's done at your other institutions and how that's done with the online teaching.
I could probably take that one. So in terms of laboratory medicine, do you mean actual IV tubing? I just want to clarify that.
Yeah. What I mean is, oftentimes nurses are asked to collect samples, various kinds, but they don't necessarily have experience with talking to the people who are actually running the samples and performing the analysis and giving the data back. So at Simmons, we have a lab experience where students sort of learn about pre-analytic errors, post-analytic errors, how this analysis is actually done. And then they also have a tour basically of the laboratory medicine court at Boston Children's Hospital. So I was just curious how that works. And we have a virtual version of that lab that we did because we couldn't take students in person like they used to go. So I was just wondering if there's something like that in the other programs or how you work that in. It sounds like you do a lot of data analysis of test results for the electronic medical record. That was one example you brought up that's kind of like that. But I was wondering, there's a lot of, the reason we do that is because there's a lot of misunderstandings between the nurses and the core people. A lot of times it's sort of well, you didn't collect the sample right or something. And so there's some animosity typically, or at least that's what we've heard. So that's why we wanted to have something, to give them an inside look at what's really going on the other side.
No, you bring up a fantastic point because I think that's a challenge in every practice setting. I even reflect back to my own current practice, every lab is so different, and how the organization obtains it, where they send it, do they do it on site? But that brings up a really good thought-provoking question. Could we integrate this better into our curriculum? Because I teach a clinical course, and I think really it's going to be it's site specific. Kind of like how you practice there versus here. We've never had, I don't recall ever taking our students on a tour. Usually we do go over like point of care testing and, best practice of that. But no, I've never taken my students on like a virtual tour, but I would love to learn more from you.
Oh, great. Well, maybe we can touch base afterwards then. I'm happy to share what we've been doing, and it's something we've actually been trying to write up. So we'd be really happy to learn more about how this is currently in the curriculum, or what space there may be for doing something like this more systematically. So thank you.
Yeah, because it could definitely decrease erroneous test results. It can improve patient care. It can improve, provider satisfaction. There's so many aspects to really educating, everybody. And I think that would be a fantastic opportunity to connect.
Absolutely, thank you. It goes with a lot of the themes you all brought up as well, of, belongingness and really feeling like someone has your back. Because I feel like as a nurse, that would be really disappointing if you collect the sample and then you just get like bad feedback and you don't really understand why and where it's, and also the laboratory medicine people also tend to be kind of frustrated as well, because they feel like there's a barrier, like they can't communicate what they need either.
Yeah, no, that's definitely room for improvement.
One of the things we did do that was exciting was, again, with our lab kits that were mailed to the house, and I'm talking, it was like an Amazon box. It was huge. It was like Christmas. It arrived on your doorstep. And when you opened it up, it had 100+ pieces. I mean, it was very exciting to kind of open it up and be like, oh, I've got tubing, and I have, a urine collection cup, and I have a hemocult, and I had, so we were able to still continue like how to collect things, how to do it safely. And again, it's very interesting. I facilitated some of these labs from my kitchen table. My patient was sometimes a family member. Sometimes I used a pool noodle. A pool noodle was great. It had for multiple aspects, but really the concept was, and we would tell the students, it might be strange that, you're using, something from your pantry as an item to collect into a specimen cup. But at the end of the day, what is the concept? Did you maintain a sterile technique? Were you able to, did you don and doff the correct PPE to approach the situation? Did you get the correct sample? Did you do it in a timely manner? Did you contaminate it? How would you label it? And labeling is huge. And I'm sure you see that on your end as a frustration from a lab partner who doesn't have an accurately labeled sample. We in turn had to really facilitate that with our students. And in an odd way, even though it wasn't done in an in-person lab, I think they got a stronger connection because they understood the difference of, and also interruptions. If you're in the process of collecting a sample, you don't want to be interrupted. You don't want to make an error. So these were really challenges that they learned to navigate and to overcome.
Thank you so much for all those insights.
Yeah, that was great. I typed a question into the box, but I wonder what lessons will you take away from this year of pandemic? Hopefully, as we move into a time of less pandemic and more normal teaching, what will you take forward, and what lessons might continue into the curriculum?
I can start off with that.
Go ahead, Stephanie.
So I think a few lessons that I've learned in, I teach med-surg. So, as we continue to evolve and our clinical partners accept us and, we create these new opportunities for improvement, I think that some opportunities that have been positive and based off student feedback was, faculty could really work with students remotely to really break down nursing judgment. Our NCLEX is changing. Our state board exam is changing in April of 2023. So it's going to be more of a clinical judgment based exam where there's case studies, and we need to move in that direction anyway. So I think that the pandemic did have the silver lining where it forced us to move a little sooner than we really wanted to. And we're breaking these patient case scenarios down and really explaining the clinical rationale of why we're doing what we're doing versus, and we can control the experience for the student. So if I only want the student to discuss heart failure today because we're learning heart failure this week, I can really just control that clinical scenario for them versus like I have to search for a heart failure patient on the clinical unit and I hope there's one today. So that I can really bring home that didactic lab and clinical experience so that they can really make those clinical connections. We've been, we've already been kind of moving in this direction because our PD, our psychiatric organizations, maternity have always been historically less and less able to take students. So now it's using the med surg and the medical specialties, our medical courses to really revision our education for the future.
I could like to add on to that too, Nancy. So one of the things in one of our senior courses has to do with leadership and preparing as the role of a graduate nurse. Some of our learning objectives have to do with that transition, have to do with ethics, have to do with contemporary nursing practice. One of the key assignments is resume building in this course. And what I'm finding is a lot of the students do not want to include their virtual clinical, because they feel the practice partners expect them to have boots on the ground experience. And the silver lining that I see that I'm trying to instill in them is, oh, no. You have a whole new skill set that every nurse prior to you has never had. You are unique and you're going to play to these strengths. And the strengths are a lot of what Stephanie had talked about. It is that enhanced critical thinking. It's exposure to more case scenarios. I taught pediatrics in the maternity section over the summer, the fall semester. And the exposure they had through these clinical sessions, which are still a full 8-hour clinical day, it includes pre-work, it includes a 4-hour Zoom conference facilitated with your clinical group, so a small setting, and a post-briefing. So it's a full day's worth of work. And the pediatric students I can speak to, that they saw in these case scenarios they never would have seen in person in clinical. So it really exposed them to a wider array. I tell students it's very hard. Telemedicine is the future. I think everyone in healthcare kind of knows that. We all see that it's all heading that way for all different types of practices. And how do you conduct a patient interview on telehealth? When you're not face-to-face, you don't have touch, you don't have that type of therapeutic communication, and you're relying on those interviewing skills. How do you create your assessment? How do you then develop your plan of care? They got to do that. They got to experience that. We know simulation, there's so much research that supports simulation. Again, and a lot of that, again, drives into that new NCLEX next generation. Our students had hands-on experience. They can now bring that into the practice setting and say, hey, this actually works. I can explain this to you. I can show this to you. And none of them really recognize, nursing students tend to think that it's those hands-on skills is what defines them. I like to tell them that's about 10% of your nursing role. You know, what makes you a BSN prepared nurse is the other 90%. And that's what we were able to deliver via that virtual clinical and really play to that strength. And that, I think that opened up a whole new mindset to them. And that is a silver lining, because I would not have even thought that way prior to this happening, and actually see it unfolding and being a part of that process.
Thank you so much.
Any other questions that we can share? Oh, Sherry.
I'm sorry, you guys have just been doing such a great job with this. And I just wanted to make the comment that that to the point about the virtual clinicals and the students being shy about sharing them, you're just so absolutely right with the framing, because you think about flight simulators and pilots, we've been doing that for decades because we've known how challenging that work is. And the fact that we continue to have so many medical errors, in part probably is because we are underutilizing things like simulators, relative to the airline industry. So I really think, you're spot on with trying to capture these lessons and the potential that we have to really improve our practice going forward.
Thank you. I love that example of the flight simulators. I'm actually going to take that from you if you don't mind, and I'm going to carry that forward. I've been kind of equating it to, you've been doing simulation all along. I go, how is everybody trained in CPR? I go, we don't go putting people on the street in cardiac arrest so we can practice. It's an eye opener because it's something they can relate to, but I love that pilot scenario in the flight simulator. So
absolutely. And to be fair, it's not really original because it's actually based on the work of Atul Gawande on checklists. And that's where some of that comes from. Flight checklists come from the aviation industry and other industries. And so trying to put those practices. And so I think simulators are just another sort of tool, along the same lines. And I'm happy to share some of the literature on that if that's helpful. But I think it's such a, such a powerful observation. I'd love to see you share that, somewhere.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other questions?